and I know that everyone here does as well. So I'm sure that y'all are eager for some questions, so we'll open it up. Chris.
Just for the first panel, I was wondering if you guys ran into any of the rhetoric around Teach for America, certainly anecdotally with a bunch of people, and it actually goes to our last presenter's field. Not only, can you make arguments for kind of serving neoliberal interests and rhetoric there, but certainly in my experience, at least 2 out of 3 of people who applied for and did Teach for America were basically doing it. Yeah, ostensibly you're rhetorically talking over at a bar, you're going to do it for the kids and all this, but almost all of them were law school applicants after they got out, and that was an explicit goal going in. And basically it serves 2 interests, basically combining to give these people a CV line to basically get into prestigious law schools, and
I'm
also
sorry, you're saying there were people coming out of law schools or wanting to go into law schools?
wanting to go into law
law
schools.
schools.
And basically, so it served 2 interests, both a professionalization step there and also, undercutting tenure track labor in the public school systems as we know it for urban districts.
It's
So I
become a
wonder
new
if
gap year thing.
what's up?
It's become a new gap year thing. You do that and
Absolutely.
then you apply to
So I
med
was
school
wondering
or
if-
grad school.
Yeah.
So
So I
there-
wondered if that appears rhetorically in any of the literature.
I mean, it's not emphasized. I mean, there's a section on the website where it talks about the benefits of, like, post your 2-year commitment, but they're focused after your 2 years. It's basically continuing to support educational reform and closing the achievement gap in whatever you choose. That's more so, it's more generic in general. And in our lit review, we do cite some studies that have been done that discuss some things that you've talked about. But on the website specifically, it's more general in terms. There is a section on the website where it does talk about, they do talk about certain partnerships they have with law schools, where you can defer if you get in, which I'm sure generally reinforces that. I know some of my fellow core members who I served with did their 2 years and then they did go to law school.
Or MBA programs.
Yeah, or MBA, yes. So there are certain programs where they have a partnership with Teach for America, but it's a really small section on the website, and you kind of have to dig to get to it.
I'm going to say you can expect more of that after law school, because these are parlous times for law students and law grads. And until the economy picks up, if it does pick up, you're going to find people going into Teach for
And
America.
speaking of that too, I read an article, I'm an alumni teacher, so I get this magazine for alumni of Teach for America. In there they talk about how the 2012 core members, I think they said 1 in like 10 or 1 in 5. It was like higher than usual. People are coming in from other professions, like law professors, military, where it's higher than it has been in the past, and probably due to economic reasons.
Do you think that TFA's mission being to go into economically depressed areas creates some of the problems that it's seeking to correct insofar as these students come in, teach for 2 years, move on, but create a charter model that actually benefits the communities that they are not intending to serve through TFA? If they're creating charter schools that a lot of people intended to be served by TFA can't afford to go to.
So from what I understand, your question is actually doing more harm than good? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, in 2 ways. So they go into these economically depressed areas, teach, and then leave. And then they may create a charter school, which is going to serve primarily non-economically depressed areas. So how is that kind of relationship working if
Well,
TFAs?
from the charter schools that we did look at, they were started by the core members who started the charter schools taught in that community. And so they may have left that they came back, the specific charter schools we did look at. And then the 3 charter schools that we look at specifically focus on at-risk students, whereas a lot of charter schools may not focus on at-risk students. But they focus on at-risk students, but not special ed students, which is also a problem in particular charter schools. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, and also we found that even though they are starting charter schools and are serving economically depressed areas, that they're bringing in this culture of market-driven reform and a culture of very top-down where maybe the community has a better idea of how to serve the students, but they're bringing in this very corporate philosophy to an area that culturally is very community-oriented. Culturally is into giving back to the community and being known in the community, yet it's more for the charter schools and the Teach for America alumni about being a committed leader and a leader. So,
And then in two of the charter schools, in two of their parent contracts, the parents have to come in and volunteer at the school, which can be very problematic for low-income at-risk. And it's basically, it's like a non-negotiable, this contract, that parents sign, students sign, and teachers sign. So some of the Cormors are doing some good in the classroom, they are getting these quote-unquote results, and there is learning taking place. However, you've got to look at, what we looked at is more of the effect of these market-driven ideologies and practices that are being implemented, and how, if that's the only solution, quote-unquote, as they say, to solve this problem of closing the achievement gap, it may not just, probably do more harm than good.
I just wanted to go back to the first point though that you made. So we're basically sending I don't want to call them crappy teachers, but new young teachers who have no experience into the schools, that we need to be sending the best teachers if we're going to have any success in closing this gap. And so in that sense, I think it almost does perpetuate the problem. Here, we're coming to help you with these questioning bases. And then maybe after 2 years, maybe they could have some more
Right.
value to add.
Right, and as he was saying, displacing tenure track,
Right.
actually committed educationalists, professionals for these 2-year rotating.
Well, New York City Teaching Fellows does it a different way too, where they basically incentivize it by giving you a master's at a city university on your way, basically paid for
Yeah.
through the thing. But it's the same thing. I mean, basically with a budget crunch at all municipal levels, they basically need to find some way to supply a labor pool cheap without benefits or retirement to basically just, plug fingers in the dam of what's an endemic structural problem of underfunding.
So yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit too. In Austin, Texas, where I'm from, we're having a major attack on the public schools, especially urban schools, especially schools that are the hubs of their communities, and schools that serve mostly poor and minority populations. English as second language learners, and so on. And so I like to think of it in terms of what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine, where if you underfund something and you make it fail, and then say, oh, it's failed, let's rebuild this in the neoliberal image, that's what happens. And and one thing to say about the teachers is that they're unionized before the charters come in, and then they're not. And you got to think about the whole support staff and all of that. And I think that starting at a very young age, the system is failing students of color and poor students and their communities in a sort of intentional way, which is really, I think, malign, and so I really appreciate what you said. And it ties to something that Dan said. I have some problems with some things you said, but one thing that makes sense is that if from the very beginning of one's life, one's opportunities and resources are extremely divergent, then for me something, then kind of trying to make adjustments later in life is later in life. But I say better late than never, and I really think that our system doesn't do a good job. But that's different than saying we don't know how to educate black people. That smacks of noblesse oblige, of white man's burden. It was like a problematic way of phrasing that, and so I just kind of wanted to point that out.
I don't know that it's noblesse oblige. This is the problem is not the white community or the black community separately. It's everybody together. The society does not know how to do it. We cannot eliminate the gaps at the very beginning.
You can't assume that white people and black people learn differently. It's not a matter of
I'm not assuming that at all.
resources.
I'm not assuming that at all. But you find gaps, you find gaps at all levels, and I saw this datum recently. A black family with an income of $70,000 produces a child with SAT scores that is comparable to a white family with income of $30,000. So we're not talking about only about a difference in resources. We're talking about a lot of other things.
Well,
And that points to some of them. The other thing is that, and the New York Times just did a story about this, this is kind of rehashing an old theme, but new data, and that is, 70% of the kids in black communities are being born to single moms, and 25% of the kids in white communities are being born to single moms. And it appears, and I'm not responsible for these studies, I'm just reporting on what I read, that single parenthood is a substantial handicap educationally.
Well, I'm a single parent, so I just want to say, you're going to identify the
This is overall, we're obviously.
Listen to me, because we know how to educate people. It's the system, that's sort of the neoliberal priorities of the system that is failing all of our children. And also it's a failure of whole systems of social services and the safety net, that people who are parents, gay, straight, single, not single, whatever race, whatever income level, have absolutely no social support. I think we have to look not to these sort of superficial ideological explanations of why things go wrong, but actually take a look at the system and structure and its interests and its imperatives. And I just think that's
I think what's interesting is that when we were looking at the charter schools and the charter school policies, that one of the comments we frequently got from people, education policymakers, was the way that the charter schools are disciplined and the admission standards and all these practices are perpetuating the neoliberalism, but also how how the charter schools aren't taking into the voices of the community, and how the community, if there were really a revolution, how we would start from the bottom and look at the communities and ask parents what the community needed. Like, for instance, one of the charter school dress codes said that a student could get kicked out for not tucking in their shirt. Well, in the community I'm from, tucking in your shirt sends certain messages that I wouldn't tuck in my shirt. Yet I could get kicked out of a charter school in my region for not tucking in my shirt when culturally. So, and parents can't talk about this, parents can't contest a child being expelled for that reason.
Let's hear from Dr. Parker. I'm sorry, what's your name?
Nothing, I'm Marlo, but I'll just shut up. I'm
Marlo.
very passionate about this topic.
No, that's the point. Chime in, please.
Don't shut up.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to say to Dan, one of the most hopeful things that I've heard you say is that we are connected. So we are connected, but we are connected within a power structure that needs analysis, careful analysis, and it requires each of us to bring in whatever scholarly, experiential, human capacities we have to do this analysis. That's what I wanted to say to you. So I'm hopeful that you see that we're connected. I am suspicious of your analysis, but because I'm connected to you, I will suspend judgment and incorporate that in my continued
All right.
thinking about this.
Thank you. If anybody wants, this paper was just a 65-page paper, will come out later in a couple of months. If anybody wants to give me a card or an address, I'll be happy to email you a copy of the paper. And then you won't have to suspend judgment anymore. You take out your axe.
No, it's not going to end here, and it's not going to end reading your paper. As Foucault talks about power being sort of this, it's capillary, right? It's in our very brains. It's in our cells. It limits our capacity to see our way out of this. We can't see our way out of this. We have to do the analysis that takes into account the conviction that you have about your view of race, which I think is the fundamental question here. How are you understanding race? And then it has to take into account, all the other, as I already said, everything that we have to bring to this. So I'll defer to Marlo for her her profound activations.
No, actually, I think I'll defer my comment on the race issue and actually ask the question to Justin since that's not come up yet, if that's okay. So I thought it was really interesting your finding about the difference between the LBG experiences of faculty and staff versus students. I'm wondering if you've got a hint at all, either in these conversations or other conversations you've had, in the differences between faculty and staff support? Because I have noticed there's a really classed system in our universities, and the reasons, why faculty may not engage in whatever support structures may be different for the staff. And it's a really important gap that I'm glad you highlighted, because we found this as well. I work in the diversity office, and in assessing our programs, we had like piles of things for students and basically nothing for faculty and staff. So we're addressing that. But I'm curious if you had any questions come up for you.
Yeah, I can only speak to that superficially because it wasn't something that came up. But I think the person I interviewed who said we're just not on the radar, I think if that's true of faculty, then for staff, they're non-existent. I think a lot of times in the way that higher education in particular is set up as our staff support, I mean, they're there to do the work that we just as soon as done. And I think that's about the extent of the recognition that they get. I say that with one caveat though, and that is there was one person that I interviewed who actually gave me this amazing story about how there was called MGM, some kind of, I'm assuming it was the type of person who cleans the offices. I don't really know. They had a staff person who worked in their department that the faculty were familiar with, who during the summer between the spring of one year and the fall of the next underwent sexual reassignment surgery. And so the person left one semester male, came back the next semester female. And the faculty person that I interviewed mentioned the fact that their department chair had sent an email out to the department saying, hey, so-and-so had this done. She would like you to refer to her as a woman. We're throwing our full support behind her, and this is kind of the status of the situation, which I thought was fantastic. I think that that is, again, probably more indicative of that type of departmental support that I don't think happened at the university level. And so I think there's a huge difference between faculty experiences and staff, and I think that those dichotomies would probably even be more exponentially obvious if you start to look at those distinctions.
I also had a question about just the study as you've done it so far, because your first anecdote that sort of changed the thrust of your interviews after that, what struck me about that is it sounded like a female-bodied person who you were interviewing, and that it seemed like an episode of harassment, which seemed like a compounding thing to being an LRB identifying person as a faculty member. So I was wondering if your findings, if at this point, or if something you were looking at is either experienced or perceived gender, and how that impacted someone's experience of acceptance at any of these levels.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I didn't speak to it much in the presentation at all. But one of the things that I noticed as I was going through the interviews, doing them and transcribing them and then writing up the final paper, is that the experiences of the folks that I interviewed were really clear examples of the confluence of sexuality and gender discrimination. For example, I believe all of the examples that I found of really positive experiences came from males who are undoubtedly benefited by sexual privilege, regardless of whether or not they want it. It's just something that's there. Whereas a lot of the female participants that I interviewed expressed a lot more hesitation, not just because of their sexuality, but because of their gender and their sex. And so a lot of times I think we like to parse them out into separate different identities, but you can't really do that because they're all, we talk about intersecting identity constructs. It's a perfect example of that. And then a lot of the times, they weren't just issues of harassment or discrimination or prejudice because of one's sexual orientation, but because of a lot of different things. So is it, discrimination on the part of a male against a female? Is it discrimination based on a heterosexual versus a lesbian person? Where do you draw the line? I don't know, but it was definitely there.
Well, and something I also wonder about is, especially since we kind of divided in staff and faculty, and kind of connecting it up with the charter schools and temporary teachers kind of idea, as universities move to some percentages that are as bad as 30, 70,
as far as permanent faculty and adjuncts, it makes me wonder too, like how some of these problems are potentially perpetuated by the fact that you can have faculty that has a lot of turnover or may not stay long enough to say invest in a community to then say bring up these issues or to be involved in change.
Yeah, so I have a story that I'll share, and I don't know how well this will speak to that, but I think it might get to it. One of the folks that I interviewed actually was an assistant professor. She'd only been at the institution for a few years, and she has, between now and when I interviewed her, has achieved tenure, which is fantastic. One of the things that she mentioned, though, is that she was fairly certain that she was hired to fulfill the department's diversity ticket. And I think, especially with some of the participants who, they've given credence to that face value diversity acceptance, that I think a lot of institutions of higher education are going for, to achieve the numbers, to check the box on the list or whatnot. I think that presents an interesting, I don't want to call it a dilemma, but it's an interesting discussion point, right? And so, whereas those issues the issues of discrimination and prejudice might be perpetuated by this gap moving away from full-time tenurable or tenured instructors to part-time adjunct instructors, I also wonder if we may not be able to be increasing diversity and visibility because we have that push, superficial or genuine, to create more diverse departments. So I don't know. I guess I don't have an answer is the point I'm trying to make, but.
So revolving enrollment too. I mean, if
Yes.
you're getting a higher turnover rate with adjunct instructors, there's something to be said about the increased potential for new faces, new ideas, new identities, rather than a department of all tenured individuals that stay there for 20 years.
So Chris, and so we'll have 2 more questions. We have 5 minutes left, so depending on the answers, we might just stop at the length of the answers. But for now, we'll just address these 2 first. Chris, go ahead.
Well, Dan, I was just going to say, when we're talking about whether or not we're going to lose this exam, whether it's the bar exam or the LSAT, or it can go down to the SAT. There was a conversion this year. I'm not sure a lot of people caught, but it goes to whose political interests can be articulated and served by the losing of those exams. When no one else but Charles Murray basically pulled a reversal this year after years of saying I got in from Newton, Iowa to Harvard because of my performance on the SAT. He was its cheerleader for quite a while. This year pulled a reversal saying, you know what, we should just get rid of the SAT because the enterprise is seen as so corrupt with white privileged parents having access to testing services such as Kaplan and whatever, Stray or whatever other prep service. He's basically saying like, the enterprise is seen as so corrupt, let's just get rid of it. But if you scrap those, like you're saying, whose political ends get served? Then does it become, a totally subjective essay question that gets you into law schools or whatever? And I wonder what you'd have to say about the kind of potential ominous, skewings of representation that could happen if standardized exams like that are lost completely. And why would he be advocating for its scrap?
That's a good question. Is this in his new book or the?
I think it was just a public speech.
Really? Okay, I'm gonna look at it. Why would he be saying this? I'm not sure. I'd be surprised actually if he didn't benefit from some kind of affirmative geographical diversity. If he came from Iowa, this was Harvard's big thing when he was a youngster.
Right. That's
Geographical diversity. So I would be surprised. As far as benefiting from prep programs, I can't tell you about the LSAT, but I can tell you about the bar exam. I am not aware, I've done a lot of reading on this, I'm not aware of any difference in the use of prep programs that is race-based. So I have no reason to think, although we're talking about money, big money, $2,000, up to $3,000 in some cases, I have no reason to think that white students are disproportionately taking bar prep courses relative to blacks.
All right.
Another question for Justin, and you may or may not be able to answer this question, but it's about your process. In your dream world, can you articulate a little bit about how you intend or what you have done to analyze the themes of these lovely narratives that you've found perhaps what tools you've used or what metrics, if such exists, and what action items you might anticipate to be drawn from this analysis?
Yeah, so like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is kind of an offshoot of the work that I collected from a master's thesis, and it wasn't focused on this interview data at all. One of the projects that I'm working on right now actually is at a different LGBT center to find out what the experiences are of the students there to see. So if we're catering predominantly to the students, and how do they perceive us as doing that? My goal after doing that then is to do, I guess I refer to it as thematic analysis. I prefer to think of myself as doing the constant coding, constant comparative method. It's a grounded theory type thing, where you kind of work through the transcripts over and over, you find the repeating ideas, themes, codes, and combine them until you get some kind of structured set of things that seem to somehow explain most of what's going on in the transcripts. My action points, if I'm going to speak to that briefly, is what I'm really hoping to do, and this will probably be a couple years in the making, because who has time for it, is to kind of work collaboratively with the folks, student and professional staff at the LGBT Center at the institution I'm at now, to see if we can't come up with some kind of comprehensive, to use your term, I guess, action points where we can improve upon, if not modify, things to make the culture at the campus a little bit better. So how do the students think we do for them? What can we do differently for that? If we can narrow down some of those things, I'm only assuming that they'd be transferable to the experiences for faculty and staff. So then what can we do? If the faculty and staff want us to be proactive, how can we create a, I don't know if it's a program, if it's a culture, if we just try to address the climate itself, but what can we do to kind of provide the services and the support systems that they're looking for? I don't know what that will look like yet, but that's kind of what I'm going for.
All right, so we're out of time. I want to thank and congratulate our panel presenters.